The boardroom trembled as sirens wailed across the city, their red glow flooding through the glass. Richard Hale stood rigid, the announcement still echoing like a thunderclap. Advisors shouted, aides scrambled, and feeds flashed with panic. He said, "They want my crown, but they'll choke before they take it." His jaw was iron, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Papers scattered, voices collided, and the empire seemed to quake beneath his feet. This was no meeting, it was a battlefield lit by screens and fear. He saw faces pale with doubt, hands clenched around phones like weapons. Trust was dissolving into smoke, and survival no longer rested on strategy, it demanded defiance. The storm outside raged, but the greater storm lived inside the room. Richard Hale scanned his circle, seeking loyalty, but finding only strained silence. Sarah Cole sat still, her hand coiled tightly around a pen. He said, "We will not bend, not tonight." The words cut sharp, but the silence that followed was heavier than iron. Betrayal breathed in unseen corners, its presence undeniable. The empire trembled not from enemies outside, but from fractures spreading beneath his very feet. The stock ticker bled red, each drop slicing at Richard Hale's resolve. Advisors whispered frantic strategies, their voices brittle with fear. He said, "Numbers are noise, but power is not." The words cut clean, but unease poisoned the room. Thomas Reed leaned back, his gaze cold and calculating. The collapse was not just on the screens, it was written in the eyes of those who once swore loyalty. Thunder cracked outside as Richard Hale pressed both palms to the table, his voice controlled but burning. He said, "We are not victims. We are predators. Predators don't beg." Some nodded, but others looked away, unwilling to stake themselves. Sarah Cole scribbled into her notepad, lips pressed thin. The silence that followed was not unity, but calculation. Doubt pressed against him, heavier than the storm. The air carried the weight of fear and ambition. Phones buzzed endlessly, every vibration carrying another cut of bad news. Richard Hale straightened his tie, chin high, defiance written into every line of his face. He said, "The world will break before I do." It was no reassurance, it was a warning. Across the table, the rival executives smirked, silence sharper than words. Somewhere within these walls, loyalty was dying, and Hale knew he would have to bury it himself. The morning broke with no peace, only the sound of relentless phones and whispers traveling through corridors. Richard Hale arrived at the office tower with his jaw locked in iron resolve. Reporters swarmed outside, their cameras flashing like daggers aimed at his chest. He walked through the storm of voices as though armored, but inside he carried the weight of betrayal. Sarah Cole trailed close, her silence carved with unease. Thomas Reed lingered in the shadows, eyes sharper than steel. Richard Hale said, "Let them scream. I will not give them my fear." His words cut through the chaos, but doubt still gnawed at every corner of the empire. The battle was no longer on screens, it had entered the blood of the building. Inside the glass atrium, the air vibrated with murmurs. Employees paused mid-step, their eyes darting toward the man who built their empire. Fear lingered in their silence, as though every glance was a vote cast against him. Richard Hale stopped in the center, the light from the skylight cutting down across his figure. He said, "This is no collapse, it is a test, and I will not fail it." Sarah Cole stood nearby, her gaze lowered, her hand tightening on a folder. The rival executive lingered at the edge, his smirk like a shadow waiting to pounce. The battle lines were invisible but real, dividing loyalty from ambition. The War Council began behind closed doors. Richard Hale sat at the head of the long table, the storm carried from outside now trapped within walls of glass and steel. Sarah Cole's voice broke through, steady yet thin. She said, "Investors are circling. They want reassurance before this week ends." He leaned forward, eyes sharp, and replied, "Reassurance is weakness. We give them defiance." Thomas Reed tapped his pen with precision, his silence louder than her words. Around the table, allies sat like statues carved from fear, their loyalty crumbling one breath at a time. The Empire was bleeding, and every word spoken in the room felt like a stitch barely holding the wound. Sarah Cole's notes stacked neatly, her pen racing. Richard Hale's fists tightened on the table, the silence between his breaths heavy as stone. He said, "They think this is the end. I will make it the beginning." The rival executive shifted in his seat, the faintest curve of his lips betraying satisfaction. Doubt was not an enemy outside. It lived here, cloaked in expensive suits and hidden motives. Richard Hale knew the war would not be fought only in markets but in the loyalty seated across from him. By evening, the skyline burned with neon, and the Empire trembled with whispers. Richard Hale stood before the glass wall, watching the storm retreat into darkness. Sarah Cole approached, her voice low. She said, "If we fracture now, we lose everything." He did not turn. He said, "Fractures are where strength is tested." Behind them, Thomas Reed and the rival executive exchanged a glance sharp as a blade. The air was heavy with treachery, its shadows stretching long across the room. The night would not bring rest, it would sharpen the knives. The storm outside had passed, but inside the Empire, the thunder was only beginning. Richard Hale sat alone in his office, shadows stretching across polished glass walls. Sarah Cole entered quietly, her face pale, her voice careful. She said, "We've lost 2 more investors overnight." Richard Hale looked at her, his eyes sharp with defiance. He said, "Loss is the price of war, we fight forward." Yet beneath his words, suspicion spread like cracks in marble. He could feel it. Loyalty bleeding away, betrayal whispering at the edges. The silence between them was heavy, carrying truths neither dared to speak aloud. The boardroom filled again, but the air now stank of doubt. Papers shuffled like weapons, glances sliced sharper than blades. Thomas Reed leaned back, tapping his pen, his silence louder than words. Richard Hale broke the tension, saying, "We hold this line or we drown." Across the table, Sarah Cole nodded faintly, but her hand trembled on her notes. The rival executive leaned in with a voice smooth as poison. He said, "Maybe the world has decided your empire has run its course." Gasps followed, but no one rushed to defend Hale. Betrayal had begun to breathe openly. The whispers had turned into voices, quiet but corrosive. Richard Hale walked the hallway, his reflection fractured in every pane of glass. He overheard fragments, rumors of a plan to unseat him, whispers of betrayal crawling through the veins of his company. Sarah Cole walked beside him, her steps uncertain, her eyes darting away. He said, "Silence is a weapon, Sarah, and I can hear it everywhere." She didn't answer, her silence more dangerous than words. For the first time, Richard Hale felt the foundation tremble beneath his feet. His empire was no longer his, it was slipping into enemy hands. The storm of rumors broke when Richard Hale discovered the truth. A report landed on his desk, evidence laid bare. Someone had leaked the company's secrets to competitors. His fists clenched as he scanned the pages, every line dripping betrayal. Sarah Cole entered, her steps hesitant. He raised his eyes, voice cold as steel. He said, "There's a traitor among us." The room seemed to tighten around them, the air sharp as glass. She froze, the flicker in her eyes betraying something she tried to hide. In that silence, Hale realized trust had already died, and war had truly begun. Night fell heavy, and the Empire's walls seemed to whisper louder than the wind outside. Richard Hale stood at the window, neon light spilling across his face. Behind him, Thomas Reed spoke softly, words sliding like knives. He said, "Sometimes the Empire falls not by attack, but by rot from within." Hale turned slowly, his stare hard as granite. He said, "Then let them rot. I'll burn before I break." Yet he knew the betrayal was real, already pulsing through veins of power he once commanded. This was no longer just business, it was survival in the face of treachery. The night was colder than the storm had been. Richard Hale sat in his office, the skyline burning with neon. A sealed envelope lay on his desk, delivered by unknown hands. Inside, a letter detailed moves made against him, not by rivals in plain sight, but by a hidden investor pulling strings from shadows. His pulse steadied as he read, every word, a blade twisting deeper. He said, "So the puppeteer finally shows his hand." The walls seemed to tighten around him. The Empire not just threatened but owned. This was no enemy he could see. It was power with no face. The board gathered again, but this time Richard Hale was armed with knowledge. He placed the letter on the table, its words poisonous. Silence fell as executives read the lines that revealed a powerful unseen investor manipulating the Empire's fall. Sarah Cole looked stricken, her voice shaking as she said, "This is bigger than we imagined." Richard Hale said, "Bigger only means darker, and I do not bow to shadows." Yet as he spoke, the rival executive leaned back with a smirk that revealed he had known all along. The betrayal was not only within, it was orchestrated from beyond. Richard Hale walked through the private lounge of the city's tallest tower, where whispers of power lived. A man waited in the shadows, face unseen, voice low and heavy. He said, "I decide who rises and who falls." Hale's fists tightened, but he forced calm. He said, "You mistake me for someone who bends." The figure remained cloaked in darkness, yet his presence weighed heavier than steel. The shadow investor was no rumor now. He was real, dangerous, and closer than Hale had ever feared. The war had shifted beyond walls, into the hands of a phantom empire. Back in his office, Richard Hale stared at the city, his reflection fractured across the glass. Sarah Cole entered, her voice brittle. She said, "We can't fight him. He has too much reach." Richard Hale turned slowly, his expression like stone. He said, "Every empire falls, but not mine. Not yet." Her eyes betrayed fear, but also doubt, the kind that eats loyalty alive. Hale felt the empire's weight drag heavier on his shoulders. The shadow investor was everywhere yet nowhere, his hands gripping the company like chains unseen. Hale realized survival demanded more than defiance, it demanded war in the dark. The day ended with Richard Hale calling his circle into a private chamber beneath the tower. Candles lit the dark space, shadows dancing across stone walls. This was no boardroom, it was a war room. He said, "If they strike from shadows, so will we." Sarah Cole looked pale, her faith breaking under the weight. Thomas Reed exchanged a glance with the rival executive, both eyes gleaming with secrets. The empire was fractured, the board divided, and the shadow investor loomed unseen above them all. The hidden hand had made its move, and now the fight belonged to Hale's will alone. The boardroom was silent as Richard Hale entered, carrying the weight of revelation in his eyes. He threw a dossier onto the table, pages spilling like shattered glass. He said, "This empire bleeds not from enemies outside, but from traitors within." The executives froze, their silence sharper than any blade. Sarah Cole's face paled as she recognized the documents. The rival executive smirked, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Betrayal was no longer rumor, it was fact carved into paper. The foundations of loyalty crumbled, leaving only fear and the bitter taste of truth. Sarah Cole stood slowly, her pen slipping from her hand. The room watched her as if time had slowed. She whispered, "You don't understand." Richard Hale's eyes cut into hers like fire. He said, "You fed them. You poisoned this house." Gasps filled the air as realization spread. She reached for the papers, but the evidence glared back at her. Trust that had spanned decades turned to ash in a breath. Betrayal was no longer faceless, it had the form of someone who once sat at his side. The wound was deep, carved by the hand he trusted most. Richard Hale's voice cracked with fury, filling the chamber like thunder. He said, "I built this empire with blood, and you sold it for scraps." Sarah Cole's lips quivered, but she offered no denial. The rival executive leaned forward, enjoying the carnage, his smirk growing into a grin. Thomas Reed sat in silence, eyes betraying knowledge he had hidden all along. The fracture had broken open. The betrayal was not the work of one, but a conspiracy rooted deeper. Richard Hale felt the board tilt against him, not by numbers but by knives cloaked in familiar hands. The revelation spread like fire. Executives shifted in their seats, torn between fear and survival. Sarah Cole's hands trembled as she whispered, "I had no choice." Richard Hale's jaw tightened, his voice low but searing. He said, "There is always a choice, and you chose betrayal." The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rival executive's quiet laugh. The empire had cracked wide open, its heart gutted by the one who was meant to protect it. Hale knew the war was no longer about survival. It was about vengeance and reclaiming power from those who had stolen it. The final blow struck when Thomas Reed rose, his voice calm and deliberate. He said, "This is no longer your empire, Richard. It belongs to those who know how to keep it alive." The rival executive's grin widened. Sarah Cole bowed her head, and the truth solidified like ice. Richard Hale stood alone, the circle he once commanded now broken. Yet his eyes still burned with fire. He said, "Empires may fall, but kings do not kneel." The betrayal had taken everything but his defiance. The war was no longer in the boardroom. It was in his blood. The boardroom was no longer a place of business. It was a battlefield. Richard Hale stood at the head of the table, his empire reduced to ashes of loyalty. The rival executive leaned forward, his smile cold and venomous. He said, "The crown is gone, Richard. You've lost." Hale's eyes burned like embers refusing to die. He said, "Loss is temporary. Defiance is eternal." The words clashed against the silence, filling the chamber with raw tension. Every face around him revealed the truth. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, yet not broken. The final confrontation had begun, and the room reeked of bloodless war. The walls vibrated with the storm outside, thunder echoing like judgment. Thomas Reed finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. He said, "The empire has already chosen. You are the past." Richard Hale straightened his shoulders, his presence filling the room. He said, "If I am the past, then let me show you how the past fights." Gasps filled the chamber, but no one intervened. His words were not desperation. They were fire, daring them to strike first. The silence that followed was unbearable, a pause before the storm within erupted. Richard Hale slammed his hand against the table, rattling glasses and scattering papers. He said, "This empire was carved by my will, and if it dies with me at the helm, not in the hands of thieves." Sarah Cole's eyes glistened as she whispered, "It didn't have to end like this." The rival executive chuckled darkly, a sound of triumph disguised as mockery. Hale's fury lit the room, a fire none dared extinguish. Yet the weight of betrayal pressed down. Every ally had become an adversary. The boardroom had transformed into a trial, and Hale stood as his own defense. The storm outside cracked, lightning spilling into the room as Richard Hale leaned closer to his enemies. He said, "You mistake my scars for weakness. They are weapons." Thomas Reed's smirk faltered, but the rival executive grinned wider, feeding on the chaos. Sarah Cole's hands shook, torn between guilt and survival. Hale felt his empire slipping further away, but his fire grew stronger, defying the very walls closing in. This was no surrender. It was his last stand, forged in fury and loss. The climax of ambition burned hotter than the storm outside. The final words came like the strike of a blade. Richard Hale stood unbroken, though every alliance had shattered. He said, "Take the empire, but you will never take my defiance." His voice cut through the chamber, echoing against glass and steel. The rival executive rose, smile cruel, and Thomas Reed followed, calm and merciless. Sarah Cole lowered her gaze, the last flicker of loyalty extinguished. Richard Hale stood alone, not defeated but transformed into a monument of rage. The empire had been stolen, but his defiance remained eternal, the fire that no betrayal could extinguish. The storm had ended, leaving silence heavy over the city. Richard Hale sat alone in his office, the skyline glowing with cruel indifference. The empire was no longer his, signed, stolen, betrayed. Yet he did not crumble. He whispered, "They can take the throne but not the fire." His reflection stared back at him, fractured across the glass, half shadow, half light. Every scar, every betrayal, every loss now etched into the man who refused to kneel. The cost of ambition had bled him dry, but his defiance was the one crown no rival could steal. Sarah Cole entered quietly, her steps uncertain, her eyes heavy with regret. She said, "It was never meant to be this way." Richard Hale did not turn. His gaze remained locked on the horizon. He said, "It was always meant to be this way." The silence hung between them like smoke. She lowered her head, burdened by guilt that would haunt her longer than the empire itself. Hale's voice carried finality, not rage, but the cold weight of acceptance. His empire had been lost, but his defiance had written its own legacy, carved deeper than victory. The board met without him, their voices echoing hollow through the chamber. The rival executive now sat where Hale once ruled, his smile sharp as a blade. Thomas Reed stood at his side, his calm demeanor masking ruthless triumph. They believed the empire was theirs, but the air carried the ghost of Hale's defiance. Even in absence, his presence haunted every corner of the room. He had lost the crown but left behind something more dangerous, an unbroken will that refused to vanish. They sat in power, but none felt safe beneath the shadow of the man they betrayed. Night fell, and Richard Hale walked alone through the city streets, neon lights painting his face in fractured colors. People brushed past, unaware they crossed paths with a man who once ruled an empire. He whispered, "Power is fleeting, but legacy endures." His steps echoed like thunder against pavement, steady, unbroken. He was no longer the CEO, no longer the king of towers, but something more enduring, a figure carved by defiance, a man who stood against betrayal and still refused to kneel. The empire was gone, but Richard Hale had become legend. The final image of Richard Hale was not in a boardroom, nor in a tower, but standing on a rooftop, watching the city blaze with lights. His empire had been stolen, but his fire remained. He said softly, "They will remember not what I lost, but that I never bowed." The wind whipped his coat, carrying his words into the night. Alone yet undefeated, he became more than a man. He became a warning, a legacy carved into the skyline itself. The empire was gone, but his defiance was immortal. The story ended not in defeat, but in haunting silence.